Long before humans could draw coastlines, measure distances, or calculate coordinates, they had already begun doing something extraordinary. They were trying to remember where they had been. Imagine walking across an unfamiliar landscape thousands of years ago. There are no roads, no signs, no compass in your hand. Ahead is a river you have never crossed. Behind you is the shelter where your family is waiting. Somewhere beyond the hills are animals, water, edible plants, and perhaps another group of people. If you choose the wrong direction, you might not find your way home. So you look around. You notice the shape of a mountain, a strange tree beside a stream, a bend in the river, a cluster of rocks, and without realizing it, you have begun making a map. Not on paper, inside your mind. The first maps probably did not look anything like maps at all. They were memories organized into landscapes. Humans remembered landmarks, directions, distances, and relationships between places because remembering them could mean the difference between finding food and going hungry, returning safely to camp, or becoming lost. This ability is far older than writing, and that creates a fascinating question. If the earliest humans could not write, could not draw accurate scale, and had no idea what a continent was, how did they eventually learn to represent the world on something they could carry? The answer begins with something much simpler than geography. It begins with movement. Animals moved through landscapes, but humans developed an unusual dependence on remembered routes. A hunter might know that after crossing a stream, the ground rises toward a rocky ridge. Beyond that ridge, a valley opens where animals gather. The route itself becomes knowledge. Generation after generation, people could pass this knowledge to others through gestures, stories, landmarks, and eventually drawings. A mountain was not simply a mountain. It could mean shelter lies this way. A river could mean fresh water. A particular tree could mark the place where a trail divides. The landscape became a collection of instructions. And once humans began deliberately modifying the environment, they created another kind of map: paths. Trails are among the simplest geographical technologies imaginable. Every time people repeatedly walk between two useful locations, their movement creates a visible line through the landscape. One camp connects to a water source. The water source connects to hunting grounds. The hunting grounds connect to another valley. Eventually, the landscape itself begins to resemble a network. Humans were turning geography into information, but there was still a problem. A mental map disappears when the person carrying it dies. A spoken route can be misunderstood, and a trail can vanish. So humans began finding ways to preserve spatial knowledge outside the brain. Some of the earliest surviving examples are astonishingly old. In prehistoric Europe, people created engravings and paintings containing patterns that may have represented landscapes, hunting territories, or routes. Archaeologists debate the exact meaning of many of these objects, because a simple line can represent almost anything. And that uncertainty is important. We cannot simply look at an ancient drawing and declare, "This is a map." A true map requires evidence that the marks were intended to represent spatial relationships. But eventually, that evidence becomes much stronger. One of the most famous ancient examples comes from Mesopotamia. More than 2,000 years ago, Babylonian scribes created clay tablets containing geographical information. One remarkable tablet, often called the Babylonian map of the world, presents a simplified representation of the known world surrounding Babylon. It does not resemble a modern atlas. There are no satellite photographs, no precise borders, no mathematical grid covering the planet. Instead, the world is organized around what mattered to the people who created it. Babylon sits at the center. The surrounding lands and bodies of water are arranged according to their understanding of the world. And this reveals something profound about maps. A map is never simply a picture of reality. It is a decision about what reality matters. A modern road map emphasizes highways. A weather map emphasizes atmospheric conditions. A subway map can completely distort physical distance while making connections between stations easier to understand. The ancient Babylonian map did something similar. It transformed an enormous and complicated world into something a human mind could hold. But how did humans learn where places actually were? That required another revolutionary invention: measurement. If you walk for one day, how far have you traveled? If one village is 3 days from another, what happens when the terrain changes? A journey across flat ground is not the same as a journey over mountains. And if you are trying to represent an entire region, simply saying, "It's 2 days away," is not enough. Ancient civilizations therefore developed systems for measuring distance. The Egyptians measured land for practical reasons, especially after the annual flooding of the Nile could erase boundaries between fields. Surveyors needed to determine where one piece of land ended and another began. Geometry became useful. Ropes could help establish straight lines and right angles. Distances could be estimated. Boundaries could be reconstructed. In other words, mathematics was becoming a language for describing space. And once humans could measure space, they could begin representing it more systematically. The Greeks pushed this idea even further. They asked a question that seems almost impossible when you stop to think about it. What if the entire Earth could be described mathematically? Ancient Greek thinkers eventually understood that Earth was spherical, and some attempted to estimate its size. One of the most famous was Eratosthenes. More than 2,000 years ago, he used observations of shadows at different locations to estimate the circumference of Earth. His calculation was remarkably close, although the exact accuracy is debated because ancient units of measurement were not perfectly understood. But the important breakthrough was not simply the number. It was the idea that the planet itself could be measured. The Earth was becoming something humans could calculate. Then came another problem. Even if you know the Earth is round, how do you tell someone exactly where something is? Saying, "The city is east of the mountains," works locally. But what happens when you want to describe a place thousands of kilometers away? Humans needed a universal system. The solution was coordinates. Instead of describing a location only through landmarks, a position could be represented using lines that intersect. Latitude describes how far north or south a place lies. Longitude describes how far east or west. Together, they create a mathematical address for almost any location on Earth. But developing this system was not easy. Ancient geographers had to combine travel reports, astronomical observations, measurements, and sometimes educated guesses. One of the most influential figures was Claudius Ptolemy, who lived in the 2nd century. Ptolemy compiled geographical knowledge into a systematic framework and described thousands of places using coordinates. His work was enormously influential, but it was also full of errors. Some locations were misplaced. Distances were distorted. The size and shape of regions were often wrong. And yet the maps became more powerful because the underlying idea was correct. You could represent the world as a mathematical structure. That idea would eventually transform navigation. But maps were not created simply because humans were curious about geography. They were created because knowing where things were had enormous survival value. For hunters, geography meant finding animals. For farmers, it meant controlling land and water. For traders, it meant discovering routes between distant settlements. For armies, it meant knowing where an enemy could move. For governments, maps meant knowing what territory they claimed. And for explorers, maps became a way of turning the unknown into something that could be planned. There is a darker side to this transformation. The more accurately humans could map territory, the more effectively they could control it. A river could become a border. A mountain range could become a defensive barrier. A blank region on a map could become a target for exploration. Eventually, mapping became inseparable from power. But perhaps the most remarkable part of this story is that the basic problem never changed. The first hunter remembering a mountain and the modern satellite mapping a continent are solving the same fundamental problem. Where am I? Where am I going? And what lies between here and there? Modern humans have pushed this question to an astonishing extreme. We can measure the shape of coastlines from space. We can locate ourselves using satellites orbiting thousands of kilometers above Earth. A smartphone can determine your position within seconds. But none of this works without a principle that began incredibly simply. Humans learned to connect places. A tree led to a river. The river led to a valley. The valley led home. Then someone remembered the relationship. Someone else told the story. Someone eventually marked it down. Another person measured it. A mathematician gave it coordinates. And over thousands of years, these fragments of remembered space became increasingly precise representations of an entire planet. The strange thing is that the first map may never have been drawn. It may have existed inside a human mind. A hunter standing on a ridge, looking toward a distant valley, remembering where water could be found. A traveler, remembering which direction the sun disappeared. A parent teaching a child the route home. Before humans mapped the world on stone, clay, parchment, and paper, they mapped it through memory. And perhaps that is what a map has always really been. Not the world itself, but a human attempt to make an enormous world understandable. Every line on a map is a choice. Every landmark is a memory. Every coordinate is an attempt to turn uncertainty into knowledge. We like to imagine that maps helped humans discover the world. But in a deeper sense, maps reveal something about ourselves. We are the species that cannot tolerate being completely lost. So we remember, we mark, we measure, we draw, and little by little, we transform an unfamiliar world into a place we believe we understand. The first map was not the moment humans drew the Earth. It was the moment a human being looked at the landscape and realized that a place could be remembered, described, and shared with someone who wasn't there. And from that simple idea, humanity eventually learned to draw the world.